Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday the 26th of May and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm presenting the programme from Edinburgh. We hope to be joined this evening to discuss today's news and events by Linda Fabiani. Linda recently retired as Deputy Presiding Officer in the Scottish Parliament and as the MSP for East Kilbride, where she'd been MSP since 2011. We hope that Linda will be able to join us in a little while. First, however, this evening, we will look at today's coronavirus update and then the headlines. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 2,016,895 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 1,783,688 have been confirmed negative and 233,207 have tested positive. There are 546 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 7,666. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 98 were in hospital last night, 6 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 3,155,733 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 1,913,809 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 127,739 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 15 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. We also have a National Records of Scotland update this evening. As at 23rd of May, 10,114 deaths have been registered in Scotland where the novel coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate, according to statistics published by NRS today. In the week 17th April to the 23rd of May, 4 deaths were registered that mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate. That's a decrease of 2 deaths from the previous week, and it's the lowest weekly total since September 2020. There were 2 deaths in South Lanarkshire, 1 in East Dunbartonshire, and 1 in Falkirk. The total deaths were 3% below the 5-year average, with 29 fewer deaths in total. National Records of Scotland has also today published data on the total number of deaths involving COVID-19 in individual hospitals and care homes in Scotland, and that data can be found on their website at nrsscotland.gov.uk. Now then, having given you the coronavirus update and also the National Records of Scotland update, I think we can tell that we're joined now by Linda Fabiani. Linda, good evening. How are you?
Hi there. I'm fine. Thank you very much. Busier since I retired, I think. I'm rushing from one Zoom call to another.
I was just about to ask you that. I suspected that was what was happening. But we're very grateful and delighted that you're able to grab a little bit of time and join us on Scotland at 7 this evening. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Our headline this evening relates to the Scottish Government Priorities Statement. Scotland's recovery from the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic will be driven by an ambitious programme to build a modern, high-tech economy while staying true to the enduring values of fairness and compassion, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said. Outlining her priorities for government to Parliament today, she added that tackling the pandemic remained the immediate priority, but people in Scotland should have the right to decide their future when the current crisis has passed. In addition to vaccinating all adults in Scotland, the government's plan for its first 100 days includes publishing an NHS recovery plan to achieve a 10% increase in inpatient, day case and outpatient activity for those who had treatment or care postponed due to COVID-19. The First Minister also announced the completion of a £12 million investment to take the East Ayrshire Community Hospital into full NHS ownership, as part of the government's plan to invest £10 billion in the NHS estate over the next 5 years. Consultation on legislation to establish a national care service will also begin in the first 100 days, with the aim of introducing legislation in the first year of the Parliament, and the service to be operational by the end of the Parliament, as one of its most important and enduring legacies. Continuing the government's focus on education and young people, from August, all 3- and 4-year-olds and many 2-year-olds will be eligible for more than 1,100 hours of free childcare each year, and free healthy breakfasts and lunches will also be made available to all primary 4 children in Scotland, as a further step towards extension to all primary school children. Recognising the importance of economic recovery, the First Minister said that the government would continue its support for specific business sectors such as food and tourism, and establish a rural entrepreneur fund to support Scotland's rural economy. Ahead of COP26 this year in Glasgow, the government will publish an indicative national defined contribution, setting out how Scotland will become a net zero nation by 2045, and will introduce legislation to make bus travel free for people under the age of 22. The First Minister said that she looked forward to working across the chamber and believed this Parliament would be the most important in our devolved history. So, Linda, there's a great deal in the priority statement to unpack there. We'll maybe touch on a number of the key themes, perhaps. I suppose it's fair to say that health and well-being really are fundamental and form the largest part of the priority statement. Which of the health aspects of the statement resonate most with you this afternoon?
Oh my goodness. Well, all of them, of course, they're all really important. But I think the National Care Service one, the push that she quite obviously is putting on that, because I think she said, it's really strange, I don't get briefings anymore, Andrew, so I've got to remember stuff. So I'm really glad you refreshed my memory there. I think she said that within the first 100 days, we're going to set up something to be coordinating it and looking at it properly with a view to legislation and having stuff in place by the end of this Parliament. Is that right?
That's it.
Yeah, I thought that was really, really important. And she's obviously got the bit between her teeth on that one. She was talking about it before the election, she put it in the manifesto, and now she's saying this is how we're going to implement it. I think that's a really serious one, and it ties in with everything. It ties in with the well-being of everyone, not just those who are directly affected by it, but the relatives, the people that care and everything. It's a major step forward for society, and I think it's to be really welcomed.
Thanks, Linda. As you say, the proposed National Care Service is intended to dovetail, if you will, with the other aspects of developments for Scotland's NHS, in particular the recovery plan to increase care by 10% in order to catch up with those who have been held back due to the pandemic, and also what sounds like a fairly significant investment in the NHS estate. Do you think that will make a satisfactory improvement in people's experience in Scotland's NHS?
Well, taking the community hospital in Ayrshire into public ownership is important. Again, that's always been a priority of Nicola Sturgeon's government. I mean, if you remember, was it the last Parliament? She took it could have been the Parliament before, actually. She took the Golden Jubilee in Clydebank into public ownership, and that was huge, that was major. And during this pandemic, the benefit of having done that was apparent, because in NHS Lanarkshire, where I worked myself in Lanarkshire, there was a lot of services were getting sent out to the Golden Jubilee. So a lot of people getting treated in the Golden Jubilee, the heart specialisms, for example, really important. So yeah, the SNP has always been opposed to the PFI PPP model that was put in place by the Tories and then really pushed by Labour. So Yeah, it's important. We own our assets. Of course it is. It's all very well saying it's how things are managed. No, very often it's how things are owned as well.
Of course, thank you. The second element of the priority statement I was going to talk to you about a little bit was the education component.
Mm.
I touched on the expansion of free childcare, the expansion of healthy breakfasts and lunches, and I think there's also intended to be an increase in the number of teachers and teaching assistants.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, as you rightly said, there's a connection or an overlap between health and well-being and childcare and
Mm-hmm.
education. And so, do you think there's a prospect of these two elements of the priority statement today beginning to work together?
I think they have to work together. I mean, I think some of the things she said and some of the ways she's put her cabinet and her government together generally certainly suggests that all these things have to work together. Putting John Swinney's post, coordinating all these things is really important. I mean, I'm a bit worried about education because it has been difficult for everyone involved in education all the way through this pandemic. It's going to be difficult to come out of it, and we've got the SQA thing going on at the moment. I have some worries about how they have dealt with things. So I think in all of this, in all this sense of well-being, in all the social policies that are going into education, which are really, really important, we shouldn't forget the core of education and making sure that those young people who have been disadvantaged over the last piece are given the time and the resources to try and make up for some of that. Because it goes right through school and then it goes into the colleges and universities as well. There's knock-on effects on all of this. So I think we have to be very sure that we get the educational aspect of education on the forefront, as well as the social aspects and the well-being aspects.
Yes, that's an interesting point that you make. I'm just looking back at the government statement from this afternoon,
Mm-hmm.
and in the education component, certainly what steps out in me is publishing the OECD report on Scottish education,
Yeah.
which I think was expected to have been published a little bit before now. The first instalment of the Scottish Attainment Fund, 3,500 more teachers and classroom assistants. The provision of digital devices, 40,000 devices to those who
Mm.
don't have them, I think along with broadband. And one thing that struck me as perhaps a little bit of an innovation is £20 million to fund a summer programme of support this year of activities for children and young
Oh,
people.
yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I
and
think that's really important. I mean, can I say that locally, we got a lot, or I, before I retired, got quite a lot of lobbying from local parents because they were really concerned that leisure facilities would close in the summer as per normal through the Leisure Trust and the council. Really concerned about that and saying that the logical thing to do, and I agreed with them, was that all these facilities should be kept open as a special case for this summer with restrictions being lifted. And I think most councils are seriously doing that now and recognise that this is a very exceptional year. So I think being spearheaded at national government level is really important. So yeah, I was pleased to see that. As I was about the play parks
mhm,
fund
mhm.
and
Yes,
Colette Stevenson, in fact, the new MSP for East Kilbride, raised
right.
the issue about autism-friendly play parks. So we have to have play parks that are truly inclusive for everyone. And that doesn't mean just shoving a wee thing at the side that says this is for children with particular disabilities. It's making sure that the whole of the play park can be used by those with particular disabilities and that it's truly inclusive. So I think that's really very, very important as well.
As we're lucky enough to have you with us this evening, Linda, I was also going to ask you a little bit about the component of the government priority statement which relates to housing. We
Oh,
have,
yeah.
I think, 3.5 billion pounds to deliver the 100,000 new affordable homes by 2032. Beginning work on a new strategy for the rented sector, and
Mhm.
1.6 billion being invested in new housing standards to support the decarbonisation of heating in Scotland. Now, you have a little bit of a background in the housing sector. Uh,
Long time
d-
ago.
do any of these announcements stand out at you in the statement today?
Well, I haven't looked at the detail of it. I mean, but what I will say that the Scottish Government's housing programme, housing supply programme, has been welcome over the last few parliaments. There's been a recognition of the need for affordable housing, and within that, social housing. I mean, the fact that it was the SNP government that got councils building again, I think is really, really major. You know, for the first time in a long, long time, we saw council-owned houses going up in East Kilbride. And it was also about stopping the right to buy. That was an extremely important element of it too. And trying to get away from what had been allowed to happen, which was almost the stigmatisation of council or housing association properties, and saying, look, this is a choice. It's not a necessity. If people want to be able to rent a decent house, a decent rent, and have good conditions and good rights, they should be able to. People shouldn't be forced into buying because they think it's the only option to get a decent roof over their head. So, yes, I think that's really important. I think there's some trouble coming down the line economically for folk. I think it's inevitable that that's going to happen. So, I'm hoping that something I used to lobby for uh, over the piece will come in more, which is the mortgage to rent scheme. If people get in trouble with their mortgages, I want, and it does happen, but there's some issues about the levels at which it happens. I'd like it expanded. People should be able to sell their home to a local housing association or even a council and then rent it back. People shouldn't have to lose their homes because they have unavoidably ended up in default on their mortgage. So I think that's a particularly important aspect we should be looking at.
Thank you, Linda. That's a very good point you make. And as you say, as we go through 2021, I think the economic challenges arising from COVID are likely to begin to bite. There's one final component in the government's priority statement that we cannot not touch on with you as well. At the beginning of her statement, the First Minister said that she had pledged to give people in Scotland a choice over their future when the crisis has passed. And she finished the statement saying, "We will put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands." Now, in such a busy legislative agenda and with so many different components here, how do you think the government and the First Minister are going to also deliver on the pledge to give the people of Scotland a choice over our future?
Well, there's a few elements of this. First of all, despite all the rhetoric that we heard during the election period and all the nonsense that was spoken about the motivations of Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP, the referendum bill was under production, produced before the last election. Michael Russell was heading that up before he retired. So there's a lot of the work that's already been done. I think that's really important. I think it's important that the First Minister has said, of course, she'll concentrate on the pandemic, but all things going well to come out of that now. We have seen restrictions lifted. We're starting to come out of the day-to-day horror of what the country has been through. So you then have to make that judgment about the future of the country. And to me, it's quite clear, as it is to so many people, as I believe it is to Nicola Sturgeon and her government, that to fully get recovery, to fully make Scotland the kind of country we want it to be, requires independence. And that people should be given the choice as to whether they agree with that prospect or not. So it was in the manifesto. Nobody's under any doubt what the SNP stands for. Therefore, that is priority as well, which has given people the democratic choice. And people voted overwhelmingly for a government that has been very upfront about that. Now, what I think is really interesting is what the First Minister was saying today about her ongoing discussions with the Green Party. I think she called it potentially a cooperation agreement as opposed to a coalition. But she was also quite clear that this could lead in the future to Green Party ministers. So I think that's hugely interesting, because what that's doing is consolidating the independence majority that is there in the Parliament and recognising the independence majority, putting it absolutely beyond doubt. And I hope to see the SNP and the Green Party working together to show people how better the country can be with independence, and how truly coming through this really hard time relies on being able to make the very, very important decisions.
Linda, that's very timely. You pre-warned us of the second story we're going to discuss. So let me explain a little bit more of that element to the people who are watching, and then we'll have a discussion about it. Scottish ministers will enter structured talks with the Scottish Green Party, supported by the civil service, with a view to reaching a formal cooperation agreement. The initiative is part of a refreshed pledge to change politics in Scotland for the better by working with opposition parties to find the best solutions to the toughest of problems, the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said. In the weeks leading up to the next parliamentary recess, talks will be ongoing and focus on agreeing policy areas which the Government and the Scottish Green Party will cooperate on. During a statement to Parliament, the First Minister told the Chamber that she is committed to compromise and constructive conversations as she extended an open offer to collaborate with all of the elected parties. A cross-party steering group on COVID recovery has already been established by the Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for COVID recovery to welcome all contributions to secure a strong recovery from the pandemic. So, Linda, Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater have written to their supporters today saying, politics does not have to be about point scoring and short-termism. We believe the people of Scotland want to see grown-up politics like this and will approach the forthcoming talks in this spirit. What do you think about an approach that doesn't involve point scoring and short-termism in Scottish politics?
Well, I think it's about time we had it. There were those of us who, back in '99, believed, hoped that our Parliament would be a bit different, that it wouldn't be based on the Westminster model, that we could have a consensus of ideas. Unfortunately, what happened very quickly in '99 was we ended up with a majority coalition government, and that was that. We were back in the same old, same old. Changed a wee bit in 2007 when we were running a minority government, a minority SNP government, when consensus was necessary. 2011, majority SNP government slipped back a bit, if I'm being perfectly honest. And this last Parliament we had, post-referendum and everything else, just became so polarised. It became the constitutional issue. We still saw a bit of that today. I was sad to see. I think it was Douglas Ross. Usual. What I thought was interesting was that the First Minister said that she'd already had discussions with Anna Sarwar and offered these same discussions to others. So I thought that was interesting. I'm not convinced that the Conservatives particularly want that to happen. I think they're going to be very oppositionist from what I'm picking up just watching. However, I think the fact that the Greens and the SNP are now willing to do that is great. The SNP doesn't agree with all the Green policies. The Greens don't agree with all the SNP policies. That's been very clear. There's differences in approach in a lot of things that there is a general agreement on, but the differences in approach. So there will have to be concessions and pragmatism on both sides. It can't all work one way. And if both parties are serious about working together for the benefit of Scotland, well, I think they have to recognise that they may have to make compromises. That can be hard sometimes when you're a membership-based party, and I know that the Greens, like the SNP, are very much in that mould. So there may well be some hard decisions to be taken further down the line, but all in all, I would welcome it. I think it's a good way forward.
Thanks, Linda. I'm pretty sure that we could discuss what we've been told will be the most important Parliament in our devolved history for the rest of the hour that we have. and I'd be delighted to do so, but I suspect we'd better move on to other news items from today.
I
But
haven't
thank you for
seen
your
any
thoughts
other
there.
news items, Andrew.
Oh, well, we'll walk through it together. It'll be fine.
Okay.
The next item we have is that in a blistering attack on Boris Johnson and the UK government, Dominic Cummings has told MPs that the government was completely unprepared for the worst public health crisis in decades, and that ministers, including the Prime Minister, were off on skiing holidays in February 2020. He said that such was Boris Johnson's scepticism about COVID. The Prime Minister even told officials he was considering getting the government's chief medical advisor to inject him with the coronavirus on television to show the public it was not a big threat, Cummings said. When the public needed us most, the government failed, Cummings said in his evidence to a joint meeting of the Science and Technology and Health and Social Care committees, adding that it was crackers that someone such as Boris Johnson got to be Prime Minister. Cummings cast the state as woefully disorganised, dominated by groupthink, and run by ministers such as Health Secretary Matt Hancock, who, he said, should be sacked for lying to the public and to the government. Mr Cumming also made an attack on Nicola Sturgeon, complaining that the First Minister did not stick to the Westminster government line when she announced what she believed she had to do in Scotland. The Health Ministry has declined to comment. With almost 128,000 deaths, the United Kingdom has the world's fifth worst official COVID-19 death toll. So, Linda, where to start with this from Westminster this morning? First of all, what do you think is Cummings' agenda with the evidence that he's given today?
Well, you know, I picked up wee bits of it, Andrew, but not as much as you've just said. And my goodness, I'll tell you what a blooming cheek having a go at Nicola for not sticking to the UK lines. If he's busy saying the UK lines were utter nonsense, and yet he's having a go at her for not sticking to them, well, you know, there's a politician of principle, and they recognise it. I'm stunned at some of the stuff that I picked up today and some of the stuff you've just relayed. I mean, it's like Boris Johnson is like some kind of poor man's Donald Trump or something. I don't know. Inject me on the telly. I mean, then I'll drink bleach to prove that it cures it. I don't know. Motivation, Cummings' motivation. I don't know. He was part of it, I guess. Nose right out of joint. For some reason, I we'll never know everything that's involved in that, but it's sounding pretty brutal. I mean, some of the stuff I'm not that surprised about. Like Matt Hancock, I've always thought he was a bit dodgy, if you like, in terms of capability. And remember when Dominic Cummings ran off and ran away, and there was all the fuss about that, and he broke the COVID rules. There was a bit of me wondered as to whether it was just to get out of the way because Hancock was in charge with Johnson in hospital, and let's just leave him alone and see what happens and not have any responsibility there. So I don't know. I don't know what his motivation is, but it's brutal stuff. Absolutely brutal.
And you'll indulge me with this one as well. In the course of his evidence, at one point, Dominic Cummings described himself as Larry Vaughan, who's the mayor of Amity Island in the film Jaws.
Oh.
And it crossed me as I thought about that. It crossed my mind that when we get to the second film, Jaws 2, Larry Vaughan is still the mayor of Amity Island in the sequel, despite what happens in the first film. So I wonder, is this Cummings signalling that he intends to stick around, perhaps working for whoever is the next Prime Minister, maybe Mr Gove or Mr Raab?
That's really interesting. So throw Boris Johnson to the shark. And then, yeah, my goodness. I wonder, you could be right. But could anybody take Dominic Cummings seriously in government after this week? If you're willing to turn on your previous best pal, like he appears to have. So, yeah, I mean, he was a huge Boris fan, wasn't he? I mean, he was instrumental in Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister, so I don't know. I don't know the man. Neither do I want to, I have to say.
I was just going to say that. Certainly, in his evidence, Cummings was glowing about the conduct and behaviour of some ministers, Gove
Oh,
and
was
Rabb
he?
in particular,
Oh,
and of course he was extremely scathing about others, such as Matt Hancock, saying that Matt Hancock should have been sacked 15 or 20 times during the past year.
hmm.
Do you think this might indicate that there are fault lines opening up within the Tory party in England?
Well, I think they've always been there. Really, they're maybe just widening. I mean, as far as Gove and whoever else he mentioned that he rates, Rab, did you say?
I did.
They were all part of it as well. Government's got a collective responsibility. So ministers are collectively responsible for things that happen. So anything that happened under Boris Johnson's government, there's a collective responsibility there, and I don't think you can take away from that. I think the Tories, they've always been good at sticking together to get elected and keep the power base and keep that institutional aspect going. And then they tend to have come apart as the power plays come in. Maybe Gove's never forgiven Johnson for sort of overtaking him in the leadership race. But, I don't think you could put a straw between any of them. I just think the sooner we're away from them, all the better. I mean, the very idea that people think we should to that, I don't know, shark pool that's down in Westminster, I just don't understand.
Thanks, Linda. We'll have to introduce a regular shark update for Scotland at 7. Clearly, that's the metaphor for the evening. But we will, without mixing the metaphors, we'll move away from the Dominic Cummings circus for the next item. And in Scotland, a £500,000 fund will help places of worship to take security measures against hate crime. Faith communities can apply for grants from the Hate Crime Security Fund developed by the Scottish Government in partnership with Police Scotland. Social Justice Secretary Shona Robison said that the Hate Crime Security Fund will help ensure faith communities in Scotland who are most vulnerable to hate crime are supported to worship in safety. Ms Robison said that Scotland is an inclusive and tolerant nation, but that our society is not immune from the threat of prejudice and hate. Ms Robison ended by saying that places of worship should be places of peace and sanctuary, and our faith communities should feel safe and secure when they visit them. So, Linda, what do you think it says about our community at the moment that the government feels compelled to offer financial support to provide CCTV, security doors, alarms, fencing, video intercoms, and improved lighting for places of worship?
Well, this isn't new. This was announced in the last Parliament. Because I remember, the local mosque in East Kilbride had, come to me about it. So it's been announced before. It's been beefed up. I don't know if it was ever actually implemented in the last Parliament, and it seems to be getting beefed up and implemented now. Certainly with an announcement of funding behind it. I think it's very, very sad that it's necessary, but I think it clearly is necessary. I mean, we've had in Scotland over the last couple of years, we've had incidences of anti-Semitism, we've had incidences of anti-Islam, graffiti in a lot of places, worse than that at times. And of course, we have the ongoing anti-Catholic stuff that we have suffered in our country for decades. So I think it's extremely sad that this has had to happen. But it's necessary, and I would hate to think that all churches are going to end up with CCTV outside and things like that. I really don't want that to happen. So I hope there's a sensitivity and a sensibility, in fact, behind it, and that it's not just applied for the sake of it, of a just in case. Because as well as being tolerant and peaceful places of worship should be deemed to be accessible to people and not be off-putting in any way. So I hope there's sensitivity applied for those who look at this fund and decide whether to go for it or not. And I would hope that lots of advice can be given by Police Scotland in a sensitive way before we would end up with very obvious security measures in our places of worship.
Thank you, Linda. The injection of some sensitivity into these things, I think the point you make is absolutely right. Moving on now, the Children's Commissioners of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have today published a letter that they have sent to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, calling for an end to the two-child limit on universal credit and child tax credit. In the letter, the Commissioners state that the policy, which disallows benefit payments to the third and subsequent children born after April 2017 in most circumstances, is a clear breach of children's human rights, and that it is inconsistent with the commitments made by the UK through the ratification of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The UK Parliament's Work and Pensions Committee today heard evidence from Bruce Adamson, Children and Young Persons Commissioner for Scotland, who presented the collective views of the commissioners in Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales. Their view is that the efforts of their devolved governments to tackle child poverty are being restricted by UK benefit rules. Mr. Adamson spoke about the impact of current welfare benefits on child poverty in Scotland and explained that even before COVID-19, poverty represented the greatest human rights issue facing children. The open letter from the Commissioners to the Right Honourable Therese Coffey MP states that the two-child limit breaches children's rights to an adequate standard of living and is contributing to a rising gap in poverty levels between families with 3 or more children and smaller households. The Commissioners noted that the policy also has a disproportionate impact on social groups where larger families are more common, such as in some minority faith and ethnic groups, and in Northern Ireland, where families are larger than the rest of the UK. Bruce Adamson said that the Scottish Government has taken some action to reduce the number of children in poverty, including rolling out the Scottish Child Payment during the pandemic. However, he remains concerned that the children's rights are continuing to be breached in Scotland by the two-child limit on child tax credit and universal credit. That is why the Commissioners have taken the step of writing to the UK Government to urge that this policy is reversed. The Commissioners conclude their letter by stating that the levelling up agenda signalled in the Queen's speech earlier this month must start by discontinuing the two-child policy. So, Linda, I think this is an interesting example of the devolved administrations and devolved agencies working together against the political choices made in Westminster. And as I say, in the joint letter to the Work and Pensions Secretary, the 3 commissioners, who are Sally Holland, Bruce Adamson, and Kula Iyasuma, they argue that we're seeing a clear breach of children's human rights. Now, we know that the Westminster government from time to time has indicated it doesn't much like human rights from time to time. So what prospect do you think the 3 commissioners have in reversing the current Westminster thinking?
Well, I'm not convinced they'll be able to. Now, we're very fortunate in Scotland. We've had, I think Bruce is our 3rd or 4th Children's Commissioner, and yeah, 3rd perhaps. And they have, to a one, been absolutely solid on the rights of children, regardless of which government they're having a go at. I mean, they've given the Scottish Government a hard time as well over many things. This is really, really serious. You know, the idea that some bairn gets discriminated against for happening to be born it's just abhorrent to me. And it's obviously abhorrent to these 3 commissioners as well. And this two-child thing is cruel, but it really shows up the Westminster government for what they are. And it shows up a tale of 2 governments, if you like. You know, you've got a government in Scotland who wants to incorporate the UN rights of the child into domestic legislation. You've got a government in Westminster who's trying to stop that happening, but also putting policies in place that directly discriminate against children. Children who don't ask to be born, who don't choose which family they get born into, who don't choose where they live. It's disgusting. Will they have an opportunity to change that? I haven't seen the evidence that was given. I know that Bruce will have presented it very well. I'm glad it's coming from the devolved administrations. But I'm afraid the bulk of the population, of course, lives in the largest component part of the UK, which is England. So unless there's a groundswell of support from there as well, I'm not convinced that the Tory government will even listen. We've written to Therese Coffey on many things, both at Scottish Government level and at individual MSP level, about disparities and unfairnesses in the welfare system. And they're not interested. That's the bottom line. They won't be interested until it directly affects their popularity. And that's the sad reality of the government that's sitting down there.
Thank you, Linda. Those are points you make very well indeed. We'll move now to some European news, and news which is also relevant for the future of our young people. And that is that a court in The Hague has ordered Royal Dutch Shell to cut its global carbon emissions by 45% by the end of 2030, compared to 2019 levels, in a landmark case brought by Friends of the Earth and over 17,000 co-plaintiffs. The oil giant's sustainability policy was found to be insufficiently concrete by the Dutch court in an unprecedented ruling that will have wide implications for the industry. The Anglo-Dutch company was said to have a duty of care to reduce emissions and told that its plan should be brought into line with the Paris Climate Agreement. The court orders Royal Dutch Shell to reduce its CO2 output and those of its suppliers and buyers by the end of 2030 by a net of 45% based on 2019 levels, the court said. Royal Dutch Shell has to implement this decision at once. Shell, which can appeal the judgment, was the 9th biggest polluter in the world between 1988 and 2015, according to the Carbon Majors database. The company had raised its targets in April to reduce its relative CO2 emissions by 30% by 2035 and 65% by 2050, compared with 2016. Lawyers for the plaintiffs successfully argued that these targets were insufficient, as such relative changes could be achieved simply by investing in renewables at the same time as expanding fossil fuel investments. So, Linda, does this indicate, do you think, a shift in tactics and an increase in pace by green campaigners now that they're beginning to target oil majors, private companies, rather than governments?
It's the first I've heard of this. This is new to me, just listening to you there, Andrew, and it was absolutely fascinating. I don't know much about Dutch law, so I'm glad that you said that they can actually appeal, because my first thought when you were talking was, I bet they appeal if they can, and they'll really pull out all the stops. So I hope that it doesn't delay things because they're able to appeal. Because I think this is obviously a landmark judgment. I think it will be putting the frighteners on other oil companies as well. And I think you were asking if it's a mark of the green lobby, if you like, getting a bit tougher. I don't know if it's a mark of them getting tougher, because the likes of Greenpeace and WWF and all these folk have been pretty tough for a long time in what they've been willing to do to get their point across. But I think what it does show is that there's a lot more public recognition about the importance of these things, and that these organisations are now getting a lot more backing from the public, so they are able to do things on a bigger level. And because this court case must have cost a fortune, my goodness, and I'm really glad they've done it. I hope there's another element that didn't come out there from what you said. You gave targets, and the court has given targets, and I'd be interested to look into it further to find out how that'll be monitored from immediately, rather than waiting to a specific point and seeing if they made it or not. So it's a good step forward, and I'm really pleased to hear about that.
Thanks, Linda. Certainly, you're absolutely right. One would expect a corporation like Royal Dutch Shell to appeal that hearing, and so this litigation clearly has some road yet to travel before it comes to a conclusion. We'll move on to one other item of European news, and that is that the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has said that a journalist pulled off a plane that was forced to land in Minsk had been plotting a rebellion, and he accused the West of waging a hybrid war against him. In his first public remarks since a Belarusian warplane intercepted a Ryanair flight from Athens to Vilnius on Sunday, he showed no hint of backing down from confrontation with the countries that accuse him of air piracy. Lukashenko told Parliament, "As we predicted, our ill-wishers from outside the country and from inside the country changed their methods of attack on the state." Belarus has been subject to EU and US sanctions since Lukashenko cracked down on pro-democracy protests after the disputed election last year. But his decision to intercept an international airline in Belarusian airspace and arrest the dissident journalist Roman Protasevich has brought vows of a much more serious action. In his speech to Parliament, Lukashenko gave no details of the bloody rebellion he accused the journalist of planning. Roman Protasevich, whose social media feed from exile had been one of the last remaining independent sources of news about Belarus, was shown on state television on Monday confessing to organising demonstrations. However, Belarusian opposition figures dismissed the confession, seeing the video as evidence that Mr. Protasevich had been tortured, an allegation repeated by his mother, Natalia. "I simply plead with all the international community, please, world, stand up and help. I beg you so much because they will kill him," she told Polish broadcaster TVN. Late on Tuesday, Belarusian state TV broadcast a similar confession video of Sofia Sapega, a 23-year-old student who was arrested with Protasevich. Europe's aviation regulator issued a bulletin on Wednesday urging all airlines to avoid Belarus airspace for safety reasons, saying the forced diversion of the Ryanair flight had put in question its ability to provide safe skies. Western governments have told their airlines to reroute flights to avoid Belarus airspace and have announced plans to ban Belarusian planes. The European Union says other unspecified sanctions are also in the works. So, Linda, first of all, there are two component parts here. Firstly, what's your reaction to the apparent involvement of the Belarusian government in forcing a commercial airliner to land in Belarus when it was due to land in Minsk? In Vilnius, sorry.
Vilnius, yeah. Just appalled. I mean, it was just I don't know. When I read this stuff, I was thinking, wait a minute, there must be more to this. This doesn't happen in this day and age. Da, 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 da. But it did, and it is air piracy, and it's absolutely appalling. I mean, we've been worried about Belarus for a long time, and an awful lot that's been going on there. This is a new level, and I mean, I don't often say great things about the UK government, as viewers will know, but they were pretty quick off the mark to condemn that this time, and I'm really pleased they did. Pleased the EU has as well, and everyone else has. I'm so worried about that chap, and it was reported that the young lass was his girlfriend. I'm not sure, his companion. My goodness, I can't begin to imagine how those that love them are feeling right now. It's just awful. There's also the worry that what else is happening in that place? If the sanctions are already there, we're now talking about not going over their airspace. That's completely understandable. But there's going to be a lot of hidden stuff going on, and it's just absolutely horrifying to think what can be happening in that country, let alone to these individuals.
So, Linda, there are already sanctions in place against Lukashenko's regime as a result of his behaviour following the disputed election last year. What do you think either the EU or European governments can do to increase the sanctions that are already in place? And will increasing sanctions have any effect?
It's always a difficult one. Sanctions is always a difficult one. I'm not up to date on what the sanctions actually are that are there. But sanctions can always be increased. And there's always that difficulty, that balance to be struck of sanctions on the one hand and making ordinary people within a country suffer on the other hand. It's a difficult balance to be struck. However, there has been a lot of democracy movement in Belarus over the years. The population are looking for democracy. They're quite clearly not getting it. And when you look at other countries where sanctions have been imposed over the years to force social change, I think I'm right in saying that most of them would say to you that the sanctions were what they wanted. South Africa is the very obvious one. For many, many years, there were sanctions imposed in South Africa, and those wishing to force democracy and regime change in South Africa wanted the sanctions to carry on. So it's a difficult one, but it certainly has to be looked at, because you can't just turn a blind eye to the kind of air piracy that went on there. I know that journalist organisations like PEN will be campaigning hugely with all governments across the world about this as well. This is one of their own that has been, in the most cruel and brutal way, shut down from the right of free speech, and it's not acceptable.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm confident that this is a story which we will continue to report over the coming days as there are further developments from Belarus. We'll come back to Scotland for our next news item, and that is that the news that new berthing tenders are to be installed at Troon Harbour to help prepare for its use as an alternative mainland port during periods of disruption at Ardrossan Harbour. Associated British Ports has awarded a contract worth around £3 million to George Leslie through grant funding provided by Transport Scotland. Agreement has also been reached to use Troon as an alternate port of refuge to Gourock, allowing more sailings per day than the longer diversion. These developments will support the operation of CalMac services when they are temporarily diverted to Troon during periods of disruption, including the construction phase of the Ardrossan Harbour redevelopment project. Work is expected to begin at the end of this month. So, Linda, what are the hopes for investment at Troon and at Ardrossan for the Ayrshire communities? Do you think there are prospects of developments in commercial shipping, perhaps across the Irish Sea?
Oh my goodness, you really are throwing them at me tonight, Andrew. It's the first I heard of this as well. And I got a bit of a turn because I thought you said birthing as opposed to birthing. I was like, what's this? What's happening in Troon?
Yeah.
So birthing fenders? Benders,
Yes.
tender, what? Benders. Benders. You can see that I've got no idea about this story. Does it have commercial opportunities? I don't know, but I'll tell you what, if there's any possibility of commercial opportunities, I know that the MSPs that cover these areas will be onto it like a shot and wanting to take advantage of any potential commercial opportunities that there are. So perhaps instead of building a bridge to Northern Ireland, we can consider Troon as a virtual bridge via ferries to Northern Ireland. And yes, that would be a good idea as far as I'm concerned. Also about the alternatives where there's ferry difficulties at Gourock, and I think you said Ardrossan as well. Always up for that. I mean, I used to actually live in the Isle of Bute, and I worked the Isle of Cumbria as well. And of course, the Ardrossan Brodick crossing is one that I have used purely for social purposes. So living on islands can be difficult. So alternatives when it's difficult to berth elsewhere, quicker routes, all these things are extremely important. Not least for lifeline services as well. So yeah, I think it's to be welcomed from what you've said, Andrew.
Well, you're making a good point, which is maybe a broader one, and we'll touch on that too. In terms of investment in the infrastructure required for lifeline ferry services, which are lifelines on the west of the country and in the north, and thinking of demands also for investment in road infrastructure, for example, in the southwest and in the northeast of the country. Do you think we might see the Scottish Government begin to prioritise these investments in order to address some of the concerns that local people have had?
Well, there's always the issue about infrastructure being about job creation, right? And that's always a very interesting one. However, things are changing a wee bit in Scottish politics. I talked earlier about pragmatism, about being realistic, and about having to make compromises. And if there is going to be a cooperation agreement with the Green Party and the SNP government, these are some of the very, very hard decisions that will have to be had. And we'll have to take into point of view of those who live in places that have difficulties, as well as the bigger picture stuff about climate change and everything else. So I'd like to be a fly in the wall in some of these discussions, I have to say, but I won't be, because I'll be away holidaying somewhere.
You'll be on Arran or on Butte. Absolutely right. I get that completely, definitely. We've got one more story this evening, and that is that Professor Catherine Haymans has been named the first female astronomer royal for Scotland. The renowned astrophysicist and investigator into one of science's great unsolved mysteries has become the first woman to be appointed as Astronomer Royal for Scotland. Professor Haymans, a world-leading expert on the physics of the so-called dark universe, has been awarded the prestigious title, which dates back almost 200 years. Professor Haymans was recommended to the Queen for the role by an international panel convened by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. She is Professor of Astrophysics at the University of Edinburgh and Director of the German Centre for Cosmological Lensing at the Ruhr University in Bochum. Her research seeks to shed light on the mysteries of dark energy and dark matter, elusive entities that together account for more than 95% of the universe. Created in 1834, the position of Astronomer Royal for Scotland was originally held by the Director of the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh. Since 1995, however, it has been awarded as an honorary title. The previous holder, Professor John Brown, passed away in 2019. As the 11th Astronomer Royal for Scotland, Professor Haymans' main focus will be on sharing her passion for astronomy with Scots from all walks of life. One of her first targets is to install telescopes at all of Scotland's remote outdoor learning centres, which are visited by most of the country's school pupils. So, Linda, two things. What's your reaction to the news that Scotland finally has its first female Astronomer Royal?
Oh, I'm delighted, What can I say? I don't begin to understand all the stuff she does, but my goodness, she does it very, very well, obviously. She's got such recognition from her peers. Two things. The first thing I would say is I don't believe she's the first woman to be so smart, so clever, and so innovative in her field. But for so very long, women weren't offered such positions and very often didn't even get the credit for the things they did themselves. So it is a mark of how society's moved on. And I'm just delighted for her. And I love her idea of, the big telescopes in all the areas that schools visit. I think that's a fabulous and very practical thing to be doing, rather than getting all highfalutin about what you're going to do with the posts. So good on her, and I think she should be supported all the way.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you in particular for taking so much time to join us and to talk with such insight and helping us discuss the news this evening. As always, we really appreciate it.
It's been great, thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And that is the news in Scotland at 7 this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we'll be back with more news at Scotland at 7 tomorrow evening. So please tune in and join us again tomorrow at 7 o'clock. But for this evening, thank you again to Linda, And thank you everyone for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.